What is up, everyone? I am TST's the Mudman. It's time to figure out what we are going to play this weekend ranked in Gods Unchained. So there haven't been any updates or balance patches this week. However, the meta has been evolving a bit since last weekend ranked event. We're on gudex.com looking at archetype popularity at Mythic rank over the past 3 days, and at first glance, everything seems pretty status quo. We see Aggro War is representing about 20% of the meta. That's been that way for the past couple of months. Zoolite, second most popular archetype at about 8% of the meta, pretty much the same as last week. Then we have Hidden Rush Deception, and then finally, Card Draw Magic. And Card Draw Magic is the star of this week's What to Play Over the Weekend episode. If you remember from last week, Card Draw Magic represented about 5.3% of the meta. Now it's up to about 7.4%. So not a huge increase in popularity, but this archetype absolutely dominated last weekend ranked event. I know for sure that 3 of the top 10 played Card Draw Magic, and in fact 2 of the top 10 played the exact same Card Draw Magic list, really proving that when good players pilot this archetype, it consistently performs well. It wasn't like a variance thing. Card Draw Magic has just been performing really, really well in the meta for the past couple of days. And let's hone in a little bit more on Card Draw Magic and discuss why it's so good in the meta currently. So let's compare Card Draw Magic to the other popular archetypes. If you remember from last week's video, we talked about how there's a lot of very greedy control archetypes existing. A lot of different gods have access to strong control archetypes. And if you remember from last week, we discussed that Card Draw Magic is favored against pretty much all of the popular control archetypes because they're controlling the board, controlling the board state, and Card Draw Magic wins the games with spells and spell boost. So if your opponent's clearing your board or putting your board to sleep, that's not really stopping your spell damage strategy. And it's also pretty strong against the majority of aggro decks. Obviously, Aggro War is the most popular aggro archetype, and it's certainly not an easy matchup for Card Draw Magic, but I would say Card Draw Magic is certainly favored because Card Draw Magic is an aggressive deck that's in a unique position where when it's playing against other aggro archetypes, it can sit back and be the control deck. You have lots of strong spells, you have your bolts, your forms of power, your ancient text, all that stuff. Even Worm Breath can be used to trade away creatures. And then if you run your opponent out of resources because you're Card Draw Magic, you'll be able to draw your resources faster than most any other aggro opponent, and then overwhelm them that way. War does have access to relics and their god power, which is relatively difficult for you to control. You can't use your bolts on relics, obviously. You may have relic removal in your Card Draw Magic deck, but War tends to play lots of relics, so that could be a bit difficult to deal with. That being said, their relics are a double-edged sword. If they use their Blades of Sticks to trade away your creatures, then they're whittling themselves down and making themselves vulnerable to big spell boosts, spell damage turns. And then Hidden Rush Deception is very weak to something like Card Draw Magic. You have cards like Tracking Bolts and Spell Boost, but can just deal with all of their hidden creatures. It's fairly common for Card Draw Magic decks these days to run one copy of Shape Blast, which obviously deals with almost all of Hidden Rush Deception's hidden creatures. It's very strong. As far as other aggro decks are concerned, we have Amazon Nature, which is nowhere near as popular as the other aggro archetypes, but it's extremely weak to Card Draw Magic. Amazon's, or Nature in general, doesn't have access to much card draw, so it's really easy for Card Draw Magic to run Amazons out of resources, and Amazons don't have a ton of protected or ward or hidden and stuff like that, so their creatures are fairly vulnerable. But then we have Aggro Light or Zoolite. This is a matchup that Card Draw Magic can struggle with, mainly because Light has the ability to buff their creature's health a whole lot. A card like Holy Writ can essentially just defeat any Card Draw Magic list. Protected Benediction is also incredibly strong. Light is just able to make their creatures health total too high, and then Card Draw Magic can't use their strategy of sitting back and doing a control game plan because their creatures are just too big to destroy. Zoolite also has access to a lot of ward and protected creatures. Sometimes their creatures even have ward and protected. That's obviously very difficult for a spell-oriented archetype like Card Draw Magic to deal with. But the issue with that is, Zoolite is pretty much weak to all war archetypes. Zoolite's not great against aggro war, and Zoolite is extremely weak against control war. And war is the majority of the meta right now. So trying to hard target Card Draw Magic with Zoolite is sort of a fool's errand, because Card Draw Magic represents less than 10% of the meta, and Aggro Light is weak against almost 30% of the meta. So trying to target Card Draw Magic with Zoolite, not a great idea. The other really bad matchup for card draw Magic is Control Nature, and as you can see, Control Nature represents almost 3% of the meta because it's definitely the weakest of all of the control archetypes currently. It's going to lose against pretty much every other control-oriented deck, especially if they're the greedy style control decks that we're used to seeing. And then on top of that, Control Nature just isn't strong enough against Aggro War. It's definitely not like an easy matchup for Aggro War to defeat Control Nature, but Control Nature just isn't good enough against Aggro War, and since Aggro War is 20% of the meta, you can't really be a control deck that can't beat the most common archetype. So the main takeaway is most of Card Draw Magic's bad matchups are just not really in the meta. As you can see, Aggro Light at 8% of the meta, Control Nature, its other bad matchup at around 3% of the meta. That's 11% of the meta that you're weak to, and then everything else you're either a little bit favored or heavily favored against. So the main takeaway here is Card Draw Magic is really, really strong in the meta currently. So now we're going to hop on over to the decks you might want to play this week. The plan is we're going to gloss over all the control decks because we've been talking about those week after week. If you want more information on the control decks, check out last week's video, the week before that. We talk about it a lot, but there's no reason to continue going over those to such great lengths. And then obviously we're going to look at some Card Draw Magic lists, including some budget variants, and then end things off with a handful of budget decks. So let's get right into it. Alright, let's talk control. The first control list to go over is this control war list made by Sifu. And at the time of this recording, Sifu is at rank 1 Mythic playing this list. And the first thing you'll notice is that this list is far less greedy than the control war list we've seen for the past 2 weeks, which I'm a big fan of. This list will inherently be much better against all aggro archetypes, including Card Draw Magic, which will be important. One strange aspect of this deck is there's only one copy of Demo. That's kind of weird. However, he does have a perfect 100% win rate, so you can't argue with that. The next control archetype I want to go over is Party Boy Craig's Control Zombie deck. And this archetype is just a real menace. It's extremely strong. We talked about it last week. This list is actually even more greedy than last week's list, as this one also has a poly at 9 mana. But the main takeaway of this archetype is, as you can see, Party Boy Craig has a 75% win rate over 64 games, and everybody else has a 71% win rate over 115 games. Usually with control archetypes like this, like a top level player will have a significantly higher win rate than the rest of the world, but with this archetype that is not the case, which is just proving that Control Zombies is not only very powerful, but extremely easy to play. The only thing protecting the community from this archetype is its extremely high price tag. And then our last control deck of the video is Sam Bam's Control Deception list. This list has a pretty fair amount of sleep. Maybe you can argue this is sleep deception. We have the 2 Spellbounds, we have the sleep darts, obviously we have the Elixir of the Panthers, and then we have the 2 demos for sleep and control. This list has a pretty high amount of healing cards, which is really great. Control Deception is an archetype that's notoriously had a really hard time healing. So obviously we have the 2 demos, we have the 2 Ember Onis, and we even have a copy of Hortuck, all for more healing, which is very strong. We also have a copy of Screamers in the Night, which is great for drawing those aforementioned Ember Onis and Demogorgons. And then, of course, you have your Cutthroat Insight, so you can beat any combo deck and really annoy any other control archetype. But that is it for our control decks. Let's talk about Card Draw Magic. Alright, and now we have Card Draw Magic. This list was made by LaBuzz, and this list came in both 2nd and 4th place this past weekend ranked event. Proving it's just extremely consistent. It's very strong, as you can see from its win rate. LaBuzz, the creator of the deck, has played 56 games with a 78% win rate, and the entire world has played 253 games with a very nice 69% win rate. So like I said, we've already discussed Card Draw Magic a lot, as well as its matchups, but it is an extremely powerful archetype at the moment. So let's go over it a little bit more. So obviously you're predominantly dealing damage with spells, but we do have some strong early game creatures. We have 2 copies of Shadow Scryer, an extremely strong creature. In the past, Shadow Scryer would get farmed by nature, specifically their Faeflame Blade, but nature is not very popular at the moment, which makes Shadow Scryer extremely hard to remove. The only easy way to get rid of it, on curve is with 2 Axewomen, and that's incredibly unlikely. We also have 2 copies of Pyramid Warden. Pyramid Warden is great for either taking early game trades or just chipping away at your opponent's life total so that you can eventually, blow them out of the water with all of your spells. We have Street Conjurer for spell boost, obviously. He's easy to wrap your head around. We've got Demetrios, who deals damage and draws card. He's pretty much a microcosm for the entire deck. Safeguard Incantation, which is an extremely strong card. It's great against something like Aggro War or Hidden Rush Deception. Usually they tend to buff one large creature, so you can isolate that large creature, play Safeguard Incantation, and then their big creature isn't dealing any damage. It's also really strong in the mirror match, giving your god both protected and ward, really slowing down your opposing card draw magic opponent. We have 1 copy of Warped Engineer, an extremely powerful card in this archetype. You can pair it with Unbound Flames if you're playing against aggro to just sort of guarantee you win the game with an extremely strong board clear at 5 mana. You can pair it with something like Knowledge when you're playing against control decks for just huge big burst turns. You can even pair it with something like Worm Breath if you have to for another variation of a big burst turn. We have Corrallus Runemoth in here. This is just a must-kill card. If you don't get rid of it, it's just Rune of Fire City. We have 1 copy of Shape Blast in here, which in the past hasn't been particularly common for card draw magic, but it's been performing really well in the meta right now. Like we said in the beginning, there's a lot of aggro in the meta currently. There's Aggro War, there's Zoo Light, there's Hidden Rush Deception, there's Amazon Nature, although Amazon Nature is not particularly prevalent, and Shape Blast is great against all of those archetypes. And like I said in the beginning, when card draw magic plays against other aggro decks, they're usually taking the control stance, and Shape Blast is an amazing control card. We also have 2 copies of Light Horde Hatchling in here because this card is outstanding. It's an extremely high tempo card. It's a 3/3 that destroys an opposing creature or goes face. It could be as cheap as 1 mana, so it's obviously incredibly strong. All in all, this archetype is really great. The only issue is its price. It's far cheaper than a lot of strong decks in Gods Unchained, but at $800 USD, it's not particularly obtainable. Luckily, I have made 2 other card draw magic lists, using this deck as a template. They are far cheaper, but before we take a look at that, I just want to make a quick disclaimer. Pretty much all of the monetary value for this deck is here in the neutral slot. The 2 Pyramid Wardens, the Ico, the 2 Blades, and the Hortuck. It represents like over 90% of this deck's value. And there are no like 1-for-1 budget replacements for any of these cards. So the budget decks that I show you, they won't function like a slightly worse version of this deck. They'll have their own win conditions, their own positives and negatives. So just keep that in mind when we jump into these budget decks. Alright, so now we have our first budget card draw magic list. This is the more expensive of the 2 lists at $75 USD. I also think this list is the hardest to play out of the 2 budget card draw magic lists. And the main focal point of this deck, or the main difference between this deck and the list we just looked at, is this list runs 2 copies of Oni Spellsword as an alternate win condition. Oni used to be a staple card in card draw magic lists, but it's been nerfed a couple of times. It's a 3-mana 0/3 with ward. It gets stronger for every single card that you play. It also gives your other friendly creatures ward as well, so it's quite powerful if you're able to play a whole lot of cards and in one turn, which is something that card draw magic is doing inherently. So it's synergizes well in that deck. We also have a couple of cards to help out our Oni. We have 2 copies of Warped Engineer in this list instead of just 1, so that you can cheapen more cards in your hand and have more burst turns, so you can have like a bigger Oni explosion. It's also good for just cheapening more damage spells to have like big burst turns in the late game. We also added 2 copies of Arcane Transcendent, essentially the same as Warped Engineer. It's more mana reduction, which makes it so you can reduce more spells, have bigger Oni turns, have bigger burst turns. It's also just like a decent tempo tool in general when you're playing against like other aggro decks. So on turn 2, you can pip out your Arcane Transcendent and play like a Tracking Bolt and sort of build your own Light Horde Hatchling on turn 2. So that's fairly powerful. Besides that, we've also added a 2nd copy of Form of Power, because that card is, fairly strong. Also, it costs 1 mana, so it's synergized with Oni. It deals face damage, so it's good with your spell boost creatures. And the final addition to this deck is one copy of Academy Apprentice, just another good spell boost creature to benefit all of your various spells, help you in the aggro matchups, when paired with Tracking Bolt, helps you in the control matchup when paired with literally any of your spells, and on top of that, it's two creatures for one card, so it does synergize with Oni. If you'd like to cheapen this deck even further, you can remove the 2 copies of Ancient Text. Ancient Text is excellent in card draw magic. It's particularly good in the Oni variant because you can choose its secondary effect of giving one of your friendly characters protected, making your Oni protected and therefore harder to remove. So it's very key. It also deals 2 damage and costs 1, so it's great for your big damage turns. If you want to replace Ancient Text, make the deck about $30 cheaper. Ancient Text about $15 USD each. I wouldn't recommend putting in something like a Surprising Blast. I would recommend putting in something like a Vow of Learning. Vow of Learning is obviously a 3-mana card, so it's quite different than Ancient Text, but it has the Protect and Ward ability to further protect your Oni. You can also protect something like a Kraus Rune Moth. There's more good protect targets than just the Oni. And on top of that, the Vow of Learning sort of synergizes with all of your naturally occurring spell boosts because it has the 2 damage options. So if you pick the 2 damage effects, you essentially double dip on a single spell boost creature. So if you have 1 spell boost creature on the board, and you pick both damage effects, each effect gets boosted by that spell boost, which is pretty nice, especially considering we do have a pretty fair amount of spell boost in this list. The difficult aspects of this deck is figuring out when to have your Oni turn. If you're in a position where you can drop your Oni early and it can't be answered, maybe you're playing against something like Zoolite and they have a weak early game and you can just play your Oni and then buff it up, you'll win the game very early. But navigating your turns, setting up your picking what cards to make cheaper, and then dropping your Oni for your big board presence turn is more difficult than simply slinging spells. So that's something to think about. This is definitely an archetype where if you have experience with Oni, it'll certainly pay off. But that being said, the Oni does give a very powerful aggro alternate win condition. This is a card draw magic deck that can win far earlier than even the more expensive list that we just looked at, because you can potentially just high roll with Oni in the early game and overwhelm your opponent like a standard aggro deck would. But yeah, although much cheaper than the list we just looked at, and definitely weaker. You're gonna have certain matchups where the Ico is incredibly important. If you're playing against a Control Zombie and they play a Necroceptor against you, you're probably just gonna lose. Whereas the deck that has Ico can destroy the Necroceptor and turn it into a relatively favorable matchup. That being said, card draw magic with Oni definitely strong, very fun. Everyone likes making a big Oni. So if you like card draw magic and you want to play it on a budget, this could be a great choice for you. Alright, and here is our second budget card draw magic list. As you can see, this list is a little bit cheaper, coming in at about $45 USD. And as you can see, we did remove those Ancient Texts, hence the drop in price. And I'm sure you'll notice this deck doesn't have Oni. Instead, we're focusing more on spell damage and having big spell boost turns. So as you can see, we have a single copy of Epiphany in here. This is just a lot of damage for a single spell. The first Epiphany you play will probably be difficult to play. I imagine a lot of the times you'll just be epiphanying to destroy your opponent's biggest creature and drawing a card. But the main value of Epiphany is playing it later with your knowledges. You can play 2 knowledges to play 2 Epiphanies, dealing at least 12 damage, providing you have no spell boost on the board. So it's a pretty good amount of just surprise burst for your opponent to deal with. We also have more spell boost in this deck than either of the other 2 lists that we've discussed. This list has 2 Academy Apprentices, so these 2 Academy Apprentices represent 4 pieces of spell boost. And then of course we have our 2 copies of Street Conjure, giving you 6 cumulative spell boost in this entire deck, which is quite a lot of spell boost. And just like the Oni deck we looked at, we have 2 copies of Warped Engineer, as well as 2 copies of Arcane Transcendence, so that you can make your damage dealing spells cheaper for those big burst turns. It's also important to remember that Warped Engineer can target more than just spells. Arcane Transcendence limited to just spells, but Warped Engineer can target whatever you like. So if you want, you can always make your Academy Apprentices cost 0, giving you 2 hits of spell boost for just 1 damage. That could be really strong for your burst turns. We also have 2 copies of Safeguard Incantation in this deck because you are playing a slightly slower game plan. Ideally, you drop an Epiphany before you beat your opponent, so you're going to have to survive until at least 6 mana. So you have your 2 Safeguards to represent some more defense as well as some more cycle, which is very strong. I don't think I mentioned it, but in the Oni list, we removed the Shape Blast because you don't want to Shape Blast your own Oni. This list, like I just said, is a bit slower, a bit more defensive, so we have re-included the Shape Blast. Yeah, all in all, this deck is, it's much slower than the Oni list, but it's capable of, some extreme burst damage turns with all of its spell boost and all of its card reduction. If you do happen to have Ancient Text, adding it to this list would be excellent. Ancient Text is great with spell boost cards, and, like I said, there's 6 points of spell boost in this list. So if you do happen to have Ancient Text, it'd be a great addition. I would recommend removing probably one Safeguard Incantation, and then, maybe you take out an Arcane Transcendent. Yeah, I would say that. One Arcane Transcendent, one Safeguard Incantation. Maybe you keep 2 Transcendents and remove 1 Academy Apprentice. Whatever you feel most comfortable with. But all in all, this list is far cheaper than the initial template list that we looked at, and I think it should perform fairly well this weekend ranked event. Alright, so we're finally done talking about card draw magic. We're going to round things off with a couple of strong aggro budget lists, starting with the most popular archetype in the meta, Aggro War. This list was made by G, and it's a pretty standard Aggro War list. You've played as it, you've played against it, everyone knows how Aggro War works. A few interesting aspects of this list is we have 1 copy of Sharpen, so we can have the very powerful Sharpen plus Woodcutter Imp combo for 6 damage. If you happen to have a Blade of Sticks on the board as well, you're dealing even more of that surprise burst damage. We also have a single copy of Shalefire Hatchling for when you go first. If you go first and you pip into Shalefire Hatchling, it's very hard to remove, and it's probably going to deal at least 5 damage to your opponent. It's pretty good. But besides that, everyone knows how Aggro War works. This list and lists like it have been performing really well for the past couple of weeks at only $30 USD. It's extremely attainable. So if you want like a quick, easy weekend ranked, then Aggro War is definitely the path of least resistance. Alright, next up we have Zoo Light, and I'm a big fan of this budget Zoo Light list. First off, it's not even $30 USD, so extremely attainable. And a list like this is particularly good against something like card draw magic. It has some of the cards that we've already talked about. It has Holy Writ. If you can get an early Holy Writ down, then your creatures just have too much health for really any aggro deck to deal with, but especially something like card draw magic. We have a Protected Benediction to give your creatures armor and then either protected or more health, both incredibly strong in really any matchup, but once again particularly good against card draw magic. We even have 2 copies of Dread Pirate, which is one of the very few ways to deal with a Shadow Scryer on curve. Dread Pirate's also obviously very good in combination with something like Axelman, giving it 1 more attack so you can take a better trade, or it's also great for dealing with like opposing armor lurkers, as well as Shadow Scryer, stuff like that. This deck also plays into Holy Writ rather well. We have those aforementioned Dread Pirates. That's a 2/2. It gets buffed. We have Madame Denholm, which gets buffed by Holy Writ or any of the other creature buff cards. We have 2 copies of Gleamweaver, which is a card I don't love in the meta right now. That being said, it is a 1-mana 2/2, so it pairs very nicely with any of the AoE board buffs. Besides that, we have 2 copies of Ritual Rod. I'm always a huge fan of Ritual Rod in these budget Zoo Light lists. Every time we see this in this series, I always mention that before Lysander Spear existed, it was very common for Zoo Light lists to run 2 copies of Ritual Rod as well as 2 copies of Cudgel, which, if you don't know, Cudgel is essentially just the exact same card. So before the OP Lysander Spear was printed, usually you would run like essentially 4 copies of this card in your deck because it's just that good. It allows you to use your face to protect your creatures so that your creatures can keep going face and your creatures can keep being buffed. It's it's really quite powerful. We have 2 copies of Call the Light in here for some more reload, so that way when your opponent drains you of your resources, you can fill your hand with some 2/2s so you can buff them up later. Also these 2/2s obviously work great with Holy Writ. At the bottom of our curve, we have a copy of Chaining of the Gods, another great AoE board buff, a copy of Cern for some stall, some healing, and some card draw, and then of course Asterius, your final late game bomb. I really like this Zoo Light list. I think it's particularly good in the meta, especially from like a budget perspective. And as you can see, This player, quadruple question marks, has played 242 games with a 63% win rate. Everybody else has played over 1,200 games with a 56% win rate. That being said, there's going to be more card draw magic this week than there was in the past, so I imagine the win rate will go up a little bit. Like I said, this list is really good against card draw magic, and it's also a little bit better against war archetypes as well. If you can drop a Holy Writ early and you have lots of potential targets for your Holy Writ, it can be very difficult for an aggro war or even a control war opponent to whittle down your board, say, after you made it that large. And if you do land an early Holy Writ, then you're definitely going to get a Protective Benediction. If you get a Protective Benediction, it snowballs and you'll eventually Asterius and it'll be great. So if you're a fan of Zoolite, if you like aggro but you're sick of aggro war, then a list like this could be a great choice for this weekend ranked event. Alright, and last and least we have Amazon Nature. This list was made by X. And last week we didn't have Nature at all. This week I considered not including Nature because Nature is just pretty bad. That being said, Amazon Nature is a fan favorite deck. It's very fun to play. And at just $14.21, it's borderline free from a Gods Unchained deck perspective. That being said, I definitely wouldn't recommend playing Amazons over the weekend. Amazon Nature is a really great Monday night type of deck, but if you finished your 18 games, or if you just really love Amazon Nature, a list like this seems pretty good. As you can see, X over here has played almost 80 games with a nearly 60% win rate, so, very respectable for, an Amazon Nature list, and like I said, the price is just very cheap, so if you've been, looking to try Amazon Nature, then a list like this could be perfect for you, but, not for your weekend ranked run. Alright, so it is conclusion time, and I think you know what I'm going to recommend this week. I say this is the week of card draw magic or aggro war, but whatever you go with, try to have fun, tell us how you did in the TST Discord, leave a comment on this video, and have a wonderful day. Hey you! Did you know that subscribing to the TST YouTube channel will increase your win rate by 6.9%? So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And while you're at it, equip Scythe of the Harvest and attack the like button directly in the face. Bye-bye!